One of my favorite things to model is rust. So when I came across this girder bridge on a recent trip, I thought this would be a great video and a great how-to on basically how to recreate this rust. So let's get started. One thing that's really cool about this bridge is that there's so many different layers of rust, so many different colors. And if you notice, the top of the rivets are all shiny. So I'm going to show you a technique on also how to recreate shiny worn metal. Now, another cool aspect of this bridge is that you can see a lot of different colors of rust on it, as I stated before. But I'm going to show you a technique on how to create this different layers of different colors. And it's actually a fairly easy technique. And this bridge is actually sitting over a body of water. It's a very easy technique to do, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. And also, it doesn't cost a lot of money. So let's go over the things that we're going to need to create this realistic rust. We just want to make sure that you're protecting yourself with when you're using paint. You know, use them in a well-ventilated area. And also, you want to make sure that if you're using cutting devices to protect yourself. So for this, we're going to be using a Atlas girder load. We're going to need 1/16 by 1/8 strip wood, because we're going to actually make a load from this Atlas piece. You want to stain your wood, so you can either use a weathering mix from Hunter Line. I'm using a dark brown. You can also use alcohol India ink or whatever you have. We're also going to use this product called Fusion from Krylon. This is my first time using it, and it's an all-in-one, so it has a primer and paint. Since those Atlas pieces are raw plastic, you want to make sure that you put some type of primer on there. And what better color to use is like this really dark brown. In addition to that color, we're going to try this Rust-Oleum camouflage. This armor paint I get from Walmart. And also Napa brown primer. Now, every one of those colors is a different color, and if you're wondering, that's the part number for the red primer from Napa. We're going to need a number 2 pencil. I'll show you a little bit later what we're going to use that for. We're going to be using the salt technique to create the rust. So you're going to need some salt. You're going to need some water in a spray bottle. And this is optional, but I like to use weathering powder. So we're going to be using dark earth, rusty brown, and grimy black. These are from AIM products. Let's get started. So now we're outside and we're going to get ready to paint these pieces. So I got 3 girders here we're going to paint, and what I'm using is just a box top and also some painter's tape. And if you notice the distance I'm keeping from the actual piece, you don't want to load up the paint on your part. And the reason for that is you don't want to lose any type of detail that could be on the piece, whether it's this piece or another detail part that you're painting. And you want to make sure that you want to stay around 12 inches or so from the part, and you want to move the can at a rapid pace. That's going to give you your nice light misting of paint. So now it's time for the second color. But before we put the second color on, we're going to want to put the salt on. So the way you do that is you're going to take your salt in your spray bottle, and what we're going to do is mist the water lightly onto the part, and then you can sprinkle the salt on, and it will actually stick to the piece. And this is going to be one technique. After you see this video, I'm going to show you another variation to this technique that I came up with that works a little bit better than the water, but the water is actually an option that you can use. There's really no right or wrong way to put the salt on the actual piece, whether you want to blow it on there like I am now or just sprinkle it on. Whatever works for you will be fine. So now that the water's pretty much dry, we're going to go now to our camouflage brown paint. Now, one thing you have to be careful of with the camouflage paints, they come out at a very high volume, and you can tell by the video how much product comes out of that can. So you really got to make sure you watch your distance when you're painting. So after I painted the camouflage color, what I did is I sprinkled the salt on, let it dry, and now I'm going in there with the third color, and this is the brown from Walmart. Notice the distance and notice the speed. And you can tell the difference in the colors, and I'm just doing random spraying of these colors. And right after, I'm going back to the salt. Notice the salt shaker I grabbed in the house. Hopefully my wife doesn't see this. Now this video is going to illustrate really how the salt is sticking to the pieces, and you can see the salt that has been painted over, and there's also a ton of salt there that has been painted over. So that's going to give us our variation. So I repeated this step a few times with the salt technique and different primer colors. And this is going to be the end result, and you can see a nice color variation to the rust. So we're back at the workbench, and I already finished one piece just to show you the end result. And you can see the different color variations. It's not just one solid brown color, there's different colors there. With the 3 different color primers, or 4 different color primers rather, and the 3 different colors of powders. It really makes a nice realistic piece. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you got to scrub all the salt off. So you want to take like a semi-stiff brush, and you're going to start scrubbing the piece. But you want to make sure that you're working inside of some type of cardboard box, because the salt is going to go everywhere. And you're going to just keep scrubbing and scrubbing until all the salt is out. You may have to go in different directions to remove all the salt, but you're going to start seeing the piece come to life as you're doing this step. So notice you're going to see the pitting now starting to show up on your piece, and that is basically the big advantage of using the salt technique, because you're going to get that random pitting of rust if this is the effect that you're trying to achieve. It's definitely a different type of technique. A fellow modeler taught it to me, and I use it now and then. I don't use it all the time, but it's definitely a great choice of techniques for this piece. Now for this application, as far as the color choices, I wanted to match the prototype as best I could. So I went from dark to light as far as the rust. So you have old rust, then you have some new rust. Now this is an optional step, but I like to distress things. So we're going to be using a 3M Scotch-Brite pad. Now they come in different grits, and these are used in the automotive industry. And the red one is primarily a more coarser, with the gray is a little bit more finer. And you know, when you're building Craftsman kits, you can distress wood, but you also can distress plastic in a way to make it look like it's worn even more. And what happens when you start to sand the primer, if you notice the panels, if you will, are starting to get lighter in the center, and then they're a little bit darker around the edges. So it definitely adds another layer of realism. And if you remember the bridge section that I showed at the beginning of this video, it's almost very similar to that, where the center of the panels are a little bit lighter than the edges. So the next step is we're going to use our weathering powders. Now I'm going to start with grimy black, and just like when I put the rust colors on, with the powders we're going to do the same. We're going to go from dark to light. And I'm using a traditional paintbrush. Now once you use a paintbrush for powders, that paintbrush is always going to be used for powders. You don't want to use this same brush to use on for painting things. So you want to have a designated set of brushes just for powders. The powders will destroy your brushes eventually. So when you're working with weathering powders, one thing to remember is you don't need a lot of material to create the realism that you want. You just need just a little bit. And you're using the weathering powders just to highlight smaller areas, not larger areas. And if you notice, when I dip my paintbrush into the container of powder, I'm tapping the brush, and what that is doing is knocking off all the excess, because you really don't need a lot of material to work this, especially the grimy black. You can really make a mess with this stuff. So use it sparingly, and you're going to really see how this piece comes to life. And when you apply the powders, you want to try to keep as much as you can to almost like a stippling method. So now we're going to switch over to the rusty brown powder. And like the grimy black, we're going to apply it the same way. We're just going to be stippling it on in random spots. Unless you're going off an absolute prototype picture, I mean, you can do whatever you want. The great thing about when you're making rust or recreating rust, you can't mess it up. So there is a prototype somewhere out there for what you're working on. So that's the cool thing about modeling rust. So now what I'm doing is I'm blending all the colors together, all the weathering powders together. And I'm using a special brush and another weathering kit that I have just for powders. And as you can tell, the grimy black and the rusty brown are actually blending together really, really nice. So the next technique I'm going to show you is how to create the shiny metal. And we're going to be using a number 2 pencil. And all you're going to do is take the edge of the pencil and just lightly rub onto the piece. And right away, you're going to see the result of a nice, shiny, worn section, just like the prototype had in the video. You can also take the pencil, you can do it the horizontal, you can also do it vertically. And also, you can sneak the pencil, if you have a nice sharp pencil, you can sneak it in there and actually hit the tops of the rivets as well. One thing to remember when you're doing this technique, not every rivet is going to be shiny. So, and also not every piece of the bridge is going to be shiny. So you want to make sure you do it in a random method. So if you think you made too much of the steel shiny, you can simply take your Scotch-Brite pad and soften up the areas, and then you can start over again. So if you take a look at the time it took me to weather that one piece, it was a little over 12 minutes. And which is neat about this technique is it doesn't take a lot of time to create a realistic rust effect. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on the wood pieces that the piece would sit on inside of like a gondola. So now we're going to stain our wood supports, and we're using the Hunterline dark brown stain. Now I'm basically just going to take the piece and actually just dip it into the bottle. But if you were using a brush, I would highly recommend, once you use a brush for staining, that's going to be that brush's duty from that point forward. So you want to assign a set of brushes just for stains, assign a set of brushes just for powders. It'll save you a lot of headaches in the long run. So now we're going to be using our chopper too, and we're going to be cutting out our wood supports. Now having one of these tools is optional. It does help, but if you don't, it's not a big deal. Only thing you have to remember is when you're cutting out your pieces, if you can, use a ruler or a grid just to make sure each piece is pretty much the same size. And if you are using the chopper, just mind your fingers. So when you're cutting your pieces out that have been stained, you're going to notice that the edges are raw wood, and I'll show you how to fix that in a moment. So now that we're using our stains again, I'm going to be using my stain brush. Now this is one of the brushes that I use just for staining. And when you use the stain, I don't need a lot of it. In fact, I just dip the brush in once, and that's all I'm going to need. And what we're going to do is we're going to address the ends of the wood pieces. And all you have to do is lightly tap the ends, and it will soak into the wood and correct that raw wood look. So here's another quick technique that another modeler taught me. And basically what we're doing is we're simulating cracked and split wood. And it's simply accomplished by taking a razor blade and just going in maybe about a 1/16 at the most inch in and just start cutting down into the wood. And this is random. You have to be really careful of your fingers on this one. Now with the wood pieces still damp from the staining, I'm actually going to now add some weathering powders to the ends just to weather them a little bit more. So now I'm adding some weathering powders to the center of the wood supports, and that's going to be to simulate that a rusty piece of steel once sat on these. So what I'm doing now is I'm using a pipette with 91% rubbing alcohol, and I'm just adding some rubbing alcohol to the top of the dry powders. And what that's going to do is that's going to soak it into the wood even more and then actually spread it out across the beam. So now what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit of white glue on the center of the beams, and I'm going to actually place the steel girder on top of that and glue it down. Now the glue I'm using here is a white glue from Weld Bond. I find that it's probably the best glue out there for this type of thing. But if you can't find Weld Bond, Eileen's Tacky Glue will work just as well. So now we're going to take our dark earth weathering powder and we're going to add it to where the steel girder meets the wood support. And just to blend in the other rusty color that I put in there, we're going to add a little bit darker, and then it's going to blend in really nice. So you can actually mix and match the weathering powders without any issues. If anything, it's going to add more realism to your model. So I hope you enjoyed this video on making realistic rust. I hope the techniques were useful to you, and definitely give them a try. So this is Ron at New Haven Rails. I hope you enjoyed this video and also the new format with the overhead view of my modeling. Have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you at the next how-to.